I'm not sure.
On screen.
Yeah, we're wrong. I'm not sure. Sure.
Okay.
It was the share.
Okay, I've got those here.
Okay.
Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's event, Greenfield's Broad Impacts, Unpacking the Environmental Implications of the 2023 Farm Bill. My name is Madison Calhoun. I'm the Senior Manager of Education Programs here at ELI. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, as well as all of our speakers for preparing a fantastic program for you today. Today's event is hybrid, so it's taking place live at ELI's office in Washington, D.C., and we also have quite a few people joining us online via Zoom. For our online audience, we will be taking questions at the end of the program, so please put any questions you wish our speakers to address in the Q&A box. The chat will also be open. You're welcome to use it to post observations or chat with one another, but please post anything you would like our speakers to address in the Q&A box. For our in-person audience, if you have questions, please hold them until the end, and I'll come around with a microphone. Please make sure to ask your questions into the microphone. That way our virtual audience will be able to hear them. Today's event will also be recorded and uploaded to the event webpage on ELI's website for members to view later. For more information on how to become an ELI member, please visit eli.org. I'll now go ahead and turn things over to our wonderful moderator today, Peter Lehner. Based in New York, Peter Lehner directs Earth Justice Sustainable Food and Farming Program, developing litigation, administrative, and legislative strategies to promote a more just and environmentally sound agricultural system, and to reduce health, environmental, and climate harms for production of our food. Peter is one of the leading experts on the impact of agriculture on climate change and is the author of Farming for Our Future, the Science, Law, and Policy of Climate Neutral Agriculture, which we have some extra books here, so if you're interested in purchasing one, please come find me after the event. And with that, I'll turn things over to you, Peter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madison. Is this on? Yeah. And thank you. This book was published by ELI, so we're delighted to be hosted by ELI here as well. First, happy Halloween to everybody. I'm sure you saw an important Halloween news that a few weeks ago, the world's largest pumpkin was grown. It weighed in at 2,749 pounds, which is pretty impressive for a pumpkin. I noted that it was grown in Minnesota. It was weighed in California, and it's being taken to New York to be carved into the world's largest jack-o'-lantern. So like today, we're talking about all of national agriculture. This one pumpkin represents that. And I think Badisha is from Minnesota, so I'm sure she's particularly proud of that pumpkin. And another Halloween fact, there are fruits called goblin's fingers, sometimes also known as Buddha's hand, and Dracula fruit, which is related to dragon fruit, which is a plant that Vanessa's father grows. So happy Halloween. And now over to the Farm Bill. We have a great panel here today to help talk about the Farm Bill and why it's very likely the most important environmental law Congress will address in the near future. I'll start with a brief overview of how agriculture affects our environment, and therefore why what, where, and how we grow our food and other material has tremendous impact on our air, water, climate, biodiversity, and health. We'll then turn to the Farm Bill, which heavily influences where, what, and how we grow crops and raise livestock and poultry. As the head of ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, said, and which, as you know, is one of the country's and probably the world's largest food processors and procurers, when it comes to agriculture, there's no such thing as the free market. The Farm Bill is very, very influential. So I'm going to quickly outline the Farm Bill overall, largely to remind you of what we won't cover in this panel. Things such as nutrition, credit, trade, which are all very important, but not focusing as much on the environment. And then each of our panelists will dive into different sections of the Farm Bill and their impact on the environment in greater detail. I'll introduce the panel, each person at greater length just before they speak, but we have Mike Lavender, Vanessa Garcia Polanco, Nadisha Bhattacharya, and Mike Drysdale here. So it's really, and Sheila Korth by video. And so it's a great panel and we're very excited. So now a little bit of background why this matters. Our agriculture system is tremendous. It produces a tremendous amount of food that we consume domestically, and we also export a lot. It's a very international system, which actually makes regulation a little complicated because we always have to think about how what we do here relates to other countries. In addition to food, it produces, it being American agriculture, is one of the largest producers of cotton, for example, and other fibers, a tremendous amount of wool, and we have about 60 million acres of corn and soybeans going to fuel. If you ever go to your gas tank, you'll see this, you'll probably see this fuel contains 10% ethanol. That comes from American agriculture. And it's actually, despite the fact that at times the food prices seem high, overall and historically, the food is relatively inexpensive. Americans pay less for their food as a portion of their income than they did pretty much historically ever. Despite that, though, the challenge is that farmers themselves, it's a very complicated food system, and the farmers don't receive necessarily that much of the food dollar. There's lots of other places along the chain where the food dollar ends up, and the farmers receive less than 8 cents for every food dollar. Over time, agriculture in this country has changed a lot. We have an image from our agrarian past of small farms that were sort of the backbone of the American economy and society. But that's not really the way agriculture is today. That's a small portion of the US labor force is in agriculture. And while we have about 2 million farms, about half of those really are essentially tax or hobby farms, and about half of the rest are quite small. It's a very small number of farms that produce most of the food, and that concentration is even greater in livestock and poultry, where it's a very small number of operations produce the vast majority of our meat, dairy, and poultry. We also have a demographic challenge that this administration and this farm bill will probably have to address, which is most of our farmland is owned by whites and most of labor is non-white. And how they're treated and the conditions those two groups are in are often very different and getting correctly a lot more attention now. One of the amazing things I find is this chart, which is from a Bloomberg report. It just shows land use. We think of agriculture, or we may not realize that agriculture really is what uses up our land. And if you ever fly or drive around and look out the window, what you see is agriculture's impact on land. That big box in the middle there, and obviously this is a schematic, is cow and pasture and range. A tremendous amount of our land is cattle grazing. And another big box just to the right of that around Tennessee in this picture is livestock feed. So roughly speaking, we get about half of the land in the US goes to animal agriculture. And that's, of course, an important factor to consider. It's a relatively small box in this land use chart that is the land that is used for food that is directly eaten. As a result of this, as well as what happens on that land, agriculture has a tremendous impact on the environment. The environmental community has often focused on factories and power plants and other big industrial activities, but the Clean Water Act and the laws environmentalists have worked with for a long time address those in relatively focused ways. But agriculture actually has a tremendous impact on our air and our water. And because of the success of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, in many ways, agriculture now is having the largest contribution to air pollution and to water pollution, to climate change, and certainly to biodiversity loss. And here are just a couple things to think about. Because of runoff from fields and, say, animal operations, there's a tremendous amount of nutrients and pesticides flowing into water. You might have heard of harmful algae outbreaks or harmful algae blooms that are occurring all around the country, or the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, which is largely nutrient overload from runoff from fields. We're all around the country facing the challenges of drinking water, recreational water, and others being affected by agricultural runoff. It's also air pollution. We don't think of agriculture as an air pollution source, but recent studies have shown that almost 20,000 people a year die from agricultural air pollution. It's not just smokestacks. As an environmentalist, I spent a lot of time working on wildlife issues, grizzly bears and wolves. And really at bottom, those challenges are operating agricultural operations in what had been wolf and bear territory. And so again, these are all challenges, but each one of these is also an opportunity of how we can perhaps rethink a little bit our agricultural system to achieve the extraordinary goals, what it does accomplish, producing a tremendous amount of food very efficiently without these environmental implications. And there's obviously another whole discussion of the health consequences of our food, not only from the pollution caused, but by the food that is being produced. And we're not going to discuss that at great length here, but it's a very important element of our food system. One area that is, I think, important, and Congress will be certainly addressing, and the Inflation Reduction Act addressed head-on, is agriculture's contribution to climate change, which was not an issue at all in the 2018 Farm Bill, and very much front and center in the Inflation Reduction Act's designation or provision of almost $20 billion to Farm Bill programs directed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But the reason why most people don't think about agriculture and climate change is because it's different. Most climate change, you think about burning fossil fuels, coal and oil, and releasing carbon dioxide. Agriculture's contribution to climate change has a little bit of that. There's energy used on the farms, tractors and irrigation pumps and fans and animal operations. But most of the contribution of agriculture to climate change is different, is not burning fossil fuels. It comes from methane, which is a greenhouse gas about 80 times stronger than carbon dioxide over 20 years. And that comes from cattle belching. People may not laugh at that or not realize that, but that's a very significant source, the largest single source of methane in this country. Animal waste, particularly when it's left in a big newer lagoon, and rice fields. So, and together, agriculture produces more methane, according to EPA, than the oil and gas sector. It's the largest sector producing methane. Another major source of greenhouse gases from agriculture is nitrous oxide, which is about 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And that comes from essentially excess nitrogen fertilizer that's put on fields. And sometimes when you put nitrogen fertilizer on a field, it's absorbed by the plant, it's food for the plant, that's great. But very commonly, farmers put on more fertilizer than the plants actually take up. Some of that runs off into the water. That's where you get nitrogen runoff into the Gulf of Mexico or in groundwater, and maybe you've heard of blue baby syndrome. But some of it also goes into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide. And there's a lot of opportunities, and I'm sure other panelists will talk about those, to reduce both these emissions of methane and of nitrous oxide. And the last way that agriculture contributes to climate change is through the land use itself. Agriculture converts land that had been grassland or forest into agriculture. And that native land, those grasslands or forest lands, held a tremendous amount of carbon. And when you convert those into, say, a cornfield, you release a tremendous amount of carbon that goes as a big pulse up into the atmosphere. But in addition, that land now that it's in agriculture and not as a grassland or a forest, is no longer actively sequestering much carbon. So you both lose the carbon that was there and you lose its ability to continue to sequester carbon. The flip of this, of course, is that agriculture, perhaps more than any other sector of our economy, is threatened by climate change. Agriculture is very dependent on the weather. And when weather changes, agriculture is affected. And it may be extreme weather like heat waves and droughts and wildfires and floods. It may be just weather patterns that are changing. Agriculture is built around certain weather patterns. It may be that as weather changes, pests that used to not be in certain areas now grow into other areas and have to be dealt with. It may be the conditions that people work in, that if you're out in a field and it's now 10 degrees hotter, that's of course a much more difficult challenge for farm workers. So all of these are, again, real challenges for America's agriculture and America's food security. What's exciting here is that the Farm Bill offers us is because this is all of these impacts that I've just discussed are happening now, but they need not happen. We have a lot of farmers and ranchers around the country that have already shown that they can produce a tremendous amount of healthy food in ways without these impacts. The challenge is that by and large, these practices are used on a small portion of American farmland. And the Farm Bill is a great opportunity to scale up those practices. And you'll be hearing from the rest of the panel about how the Farm Bill could do that even better in the years to come. And now we then turn to the Farm Bill. We're going to be speaking about those key provisions of the Farm Bill that really directly affect the environment. But there's a lot of things that the Farm Bill does that we're not going to talk about. Most importantly is nutrition. You've probably all heard of SNAP, or formerly called food stamps, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That feeds about 44 million people. It has controversies of work requirements and food requirements and others. Super important for many people and for this country as a whole. But by and large, we're not going to talk about that. But I want to emphasize that's not by any stretch saying it's not a super important part of the Farm Bill. You'll see other titles here on things like trade. The U.S. Department of Agriculture promotes the sale of U.S. food abroad and also provides international food aid. You'll see the rural development title. Although this is called the Farm Bill, it also, for example, supports broadband internet in rural communities. And you'll see the forestry title. We'll be focusing on agriculture, but the United States Forest Service is within the U.S. Department of Agriculture and, of course, runs about 45 million acres of forest land, tremendously important both economically and in terms of resource and climate change. So there's a lot else here, and I just want to emphasize that we are intentionally not going over those to ensure we have enough time to focus on the impact on the environment. So if you look at the Farm Bill over the last 20 years, this is the spending over the last 30 years, actually, the last 20 and projected for the next 10. You'll see the biggest bar here is what I mentioned, the nutrition title. About 75 are projected to be about 80% of the spending will be feeding people through the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and other related nutrition programs. You'll also see at the bottom the farm support programs. Sheila will be talking about the crop insurance and commodities programs, and Mike will be talking about the conservation programs. Vanessa and Vidisha and Mike will be talking about all the programs. But you see how while they seem in this graph relatively small, they're still total up to many, many billions of dollars every year. So moving ahead, we look at the 2023 Farm Bill, and this is more complicated than certainly that I understand, but we use the term the baseline, which is sort of the 2018 Farm Bill. Imagine it going forward. And this is where we are, just to give you a sense. Again, the vast majority is the nutrition program, And you see these big pie wedges here for crop insurance, the commodity program, conservation, and then that little wedge with those other Farm Bill programs that are still have a tremendous impact on what, where, and how American farmers produce food and fuel and fiber. So with that brief introduction, now we're going to go to Mike Lavender, who will talk. No, I think Sheila goes first. No, I think you go first.
All right.
You're going first. Mike's going to go into more detail about the conservation program provisions of the Farm Bill. Mike leads the National Sustainable Agriculture's overall policy and advocacy efforts. Prior to NSAC, he was a senior manager of government affairs at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and before that at the Environmental Working Group, and also spent 6 years on the Hill in the office of former Senator Herb Kohl, where he's worked on agriculture for probably many decades. So we're very lucky to have Mike here, and I think I pass this over to you.
Great.
There you go.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks to ELI for hosting. Good to be with you today. And thanks, Peter, for these awesome decorations. I don't know if they come through on the video, but we've got some great Halloween decorations here on the table here. So as Peter said, I'm going to dive into conservation, Title II of the Farm Bill, and talk about some of the key dynamics heading into the 2023/2024 Farm Bill. First, before we get to that, a quick word about NSAC and who we are. Peter gave a quick overview. NSAC is a grassroots alliance of over 150 organizations from around the country. We've been around for over 30 years. NSAC members are the farm, food, conservation, and rural organizations that work with and support small and mid-sized farmers and ranchers, right? So the folks that we're working with are the small and mid-sized farmers and ranchers throughout the country. NSAC's mission, right? We're striving to build a more sustainable, equitable, and just food system through federal farm and food policy. So just one more quick word before diving into the details here. Just a bit more about how NSAC functions. Farmers and stakeholders share their experiences, ideas with federal policy and with federal programs. And they share those with local and regional groups in their area. And those local and regional groups are in turn members of NSAC. We take those policy experiences, those experiences folks have working with federal programs, and translate them to the federal level. So just wanted to provide that context. So switching over here, let's talk a little bit about conservation policy within the Farm Bill. We'll start with a quick overview of some of the key conservation programs, and then we'll unpack several main themes heading into this Farm Bill reauthorization. So first here, there are more than 20 USDA programs and sub-programs, I'm sure as Badisha will touch on in a little bit here, that directly or indirectly assist farmers through technical assistance, through financial assistance, in order to encourage participation in conservation practices. Participation in all USDA conservation programs is voluntary. There's not a single requirement for participation in USDA conservation programs. Broadly speaking, USDA conservation programs strive to protect soil, water, wildlife, and other natural resources on privately owned lands in order to limit environmental impacts. Now, let's see here. Some of the key conservation programs, as we said, there's over 20 programs and sub-programs. Just wanted to highlight 5 of the main programs. The majority of these are what we call working lands conservation programs, which is conservation programs that essentially farmers can utilize while still actively producing on the land. The Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, is a land retirement program where the government pays farmers, producers to take land out of active farming, out of active production, in order to restore some of the benefit to the land. But the other 4, CSP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, RCPP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and ACEP, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, are examples of working lands conservation programs. So let's talk a little bit, just with that quick overview, about the benefits and the popularity of agricultural conservation programs within the United States. So Environmental benefits. We know through an increasingly robust set of science that conservation practices, when adopted, particularly at high levels in a whole farm system, even at a landscape level, they can build soil health, they can improve greenhouse gas mitigation, enhance wildlife habitat and biodiversity, improve water quality, and help farmers and communities, right, rural communities, not even just rural communities, but cities as well, better survive the hazards that we're increasingly experiencing, whether that be droughts, floods, or other impacts. At the same time, while we see those environmental impacts, benefits from conservation practices, there's also a tangible benefit to productivity and profitability when adopting conservation practices, when a farmer adopts conservation practices. So ranging from making yields more stable, increasing yields, and often allowing for overall increases in production and profitability. These are some of the things that conservation practices, when properly implemented on scale at a farm, can also bring. So it's about the environment, but it's also about a farmer's viability of working on the land. So despite these benefits that we see, and despite the popularity of the conservation programs that USDA administers, over 110,000 farmers were turned away from conservation programs, just two of the 20 in 2022 alone. So if conservation programs and the adoption of agricultural practices are going to help us achieve our climate goals, our environmental goals, supporting farmers in an increasingly climate severe context, the solution is not to have programs that turn away this many farmers, right? This cannot be the way that we continue going forward. So let's dig into a little bit more of what that means. We talked about briefly the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP, one of the hallmark major conservation programs at USDA that really truly incentivizes higher levels of conservation stewardship. In 2022, CSP rejected roughly 75% of program applicants due to a lack of funding. So you have a huge interest among farmers to access these programs, and due to a lack of funding, in part due to decisions made in the 2014 and 2018 farm bills, farmers simply can't access them when they've told us time and time again they want to. For the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the picture is a little bit worse, although on par. 79% of farmers who were interested in 2022 and applied were rejected from the program. So there's tremendous interest amongst farmers in accessing these programs. It's not all bad news. Enter the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act that Peter mentioned, and he mentioned the $20 billion. IRA contained roughly $20 billion for the incentivization and adoption of climate smart agricultural practices to those four key conservation programs: CSP, EQIP, RCPP, and ASAP. The language, specifically as drafted within the IRA, is for the adoption or to incentivize agricultural practices that directly improve soil carbon, reduce nitrogen losses, reduce, capture, avoid, or sequester carbon dioxide, et cetera, associated with agricultural production. The agricultural practices that meet this threshold were not defined within IRA, right? That is left up to USDA, and as determined by the Secretary. USDA recently came out with their FY24 Climate Smart Agriculture and Forestry Practice List, and they'll continue to do so and update it throughout the course as science improves and we get better data on which practices truly meet some of these criteria. So just to circle back, we know there's a huge demand for some of these programs. In FY23 alone, IRA, right, was penciled out by fiscal year FY23 through FY26. FY23 is now technically over. The data strongly indicates that demand for FY23 IRA funds for conservation programs far outstrips funding available. So we know that there's this consistent demand for investment in climate smart agricultural practices. This chart right here, which is from an NSAC blog, I think helps to illustrate really succinctly, at least in my mind, the benefit and the additional add-on that the IRA investment, in this case, particularly CSP, provides. You can see in FY21 and FY22, there's about $800 million for new practices within CSP. The red there is the portion of that overall total that went to climate smart agriculture and forestry practices. If you look in FY23, again, these are still projected numbers, but the IRA invests about 250 million in CSP for those exact same practices, investing more in those practices, but also freeing up more money for what we would think of as traditional conservation. So the investments of IRA aren't strictly for farmers and ranchers who want to adopt climate smart practices, right? It opens up and increases availability for conservation practices for all farmers. Now, what does this mean for the 2023 or for this Farm Bill reauthorization? Most of you will know that rarely do farm bills have an influx of additional money, right? Where it's kind of there's no new money is the phrase that folks like to use. Due to reporting that we've seen and conversations that we know are happening, many folks would like to see the IRA funding that is unspent at this point, so FY24 through FY26, rescinded and repurposed for things outside of conservation, rescinded and repurposed for things outside of a climate focus. NSAC is a part of a broad coalition, in fact, 643 organizations and NSAC, calling for the protection of the IRA funds within a Farm Bill context. The single biggest climate goal and environmental goal, in our estimation, in the 2023 Farm Bill reauthorization is protecting IRA funds, keeping them entitled to, keeping them conservation focused, and keeping them focused on climate. So, in addition to the top priority of protecting IRA funds, more broadly speaking, and just kind of wanted to share these, won't run through all of these in detail. NSAC has a 150-page Farm Bill platform, which has plenty of detail, should you so be interested, and happy to dig into that. But broadly speaking, NSAC's goals for the conservation title are to support the growing demand for financial and technical assistance for the programs, including a couple of the programs that I mentioned earlier, as well as increasing program accessibility. So things like increasing set-asides for beginning and socially disadvantaged farmers within EQIP and CSP, strengthening support for organic producers, and reinstating automatic renewals for farmers who are willing to continue conservation efforts. I wanted to end here. This is my last slide here before I turn it over to Vanessa or whoever's next. With conservation compliance, we started off by saying conservation programs at USDA are voluntary. That is true. There is, however, something that's known as conservation compliance, which really simply can be thought of as a deal between taxpayers and farmers, right? That all farms receiving commodity, crop insurance, and other subsidies, farm loans, et cetera, are required to have a minimum soil and wetland conservation threshold, meet a minimum threshold, in order to maintain their eligibility for some of the programs that Sheila's going to talk about in Titles 1 and Title 11 of the farm. A good example, if you look at the map, all of those red dots are in 2012, 10,000 acres. Each dot is 10,000 acres of highly erodible cropland. Any farmer that produces an annually tilled crop on highly erodible cropland must implement a USDA-approved conservation plan for that land. Conservation compliance is great in theory, but there are some real challenges with it. And we'll have to see what this Farm Bill holds for conservation compliance. But certainly heading into the future, one of the major opportunities and critical needs is to expand the scope of conservation compliance and to strengthen its enforcement. Enforcement of conservation compliance requires spot checks and a lot of different moving pieces. Enforcement in recent years has been lacking and inconsistent in many of the states that perhaps most need enforcement or have the greatest area to enforce. But there's also a need to expand the scope of conservation compliance, thinking about things like a national sod saver provision. Instead of focusing on limiting subsidies to plowing up cropland in just 4 states or a handful of states in the Midwest, we should expand that nationally. So there's a huge opportunity to expand the scope of conservation compliance and to strengthen its enforcement. And I think with that, would love to stay in touch, but I'll leave it with that and turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And you see why NSAC is such a powerful force because of their thoughtful work on the Farm Bill. Next, we're going to have Sheila Korth, who is going to join us by video. Hi, Sheila. Sheila will discuss the 2 main subsidy titles, what's often called the farm subsidy safety net. the commodity and crop insurance titles. Sheila is Senior Policy Analyst with the Taxpayers for Common Sense. She grew up on a corn, soybean, and cattle farm in North Nebraska, where her interest in reforming agriculture, energy, and budget policies began. In 2007, she received the Harry S. Truman National Scholarship for Public Service, and she's worked on Capitol Hill and several other agriculture and budget NGOs before joining Taxpayers for Common Sense. And it's a great pleasure to have you join us. Over to you, Sheila.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks to the Environmental Law Institute for having me today. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. So I'm with Taxpayers for Common Sense, as Peter mentioned, and we are a nonpartisan budget watchdog group based in Washington, D.C., but I actually work from home in Omaha, Nebraska. So thanks for allowing me to join virtually today. I'm going to provide an overview of the fiscal and the environmental impacts and costs in the Farm Bill, and where subsidies pertain to Halloween, I'll try to note these as well. So first, an overview of Farm Bill costs. As Peter's slides showed, the Farm Bill is expected to cost taxpayers roughly $1.4 trillion over 10 years, and that's referring to the 2018 Farm Bill. I'm going to dive into the commodity programs and the crop insurance subsidies in the Farm Bill. So if you can move to the first slide, please. This is a pie chart that zooms in on the non-nutrition spending in the Farm Bill. So diving in a little bit narrower than the slide that Peter showed. So as you can see, about 1/4 of that spending goes to commodity subsidies, about half of the spending goes to crop insurance, and then about another 1/4 goes to conservation programs that Mike covered. Overall, when you add the commodity subsidies and the crop insurance subsidies together in the Farm Bill, you're looking at roughly $15 billion each year, although that does fluctuate from year to year. Importantly, this pie chart does not include that additional Inflation Reduction Act conservation spending, and it also does not include a lot of the additional subsidies that have been added to the agricultural sector over the last few years, including subsidies for COVID, disaster aid, and others. So I'm going to dive deeper into the commodity programs first, and then go into crop insurance. So importantly, the Farm Bill commodity title does include a few separate programs for dairy and also sugar. So those definitely relate to candy ingredients that some of your children or you might be enjoying later today. But I'm going to focus on the two costliest programs for taxpayers in the commodity title, which include PLC and ARC. So these are two programs that have been around for a few farm bills. The first one is price loss coverage, or PLC, and this provides subsidy payments to certain crop producers when the price of a certain crop falls below a government set level. And then the Agriculture Risk Coverage Program provides taxpayer subsidies based on a dip in revenue as compared to a historic average. Most of these subsidies in the Farm Bill commodity title flow to just a handful of crops. So you're looking at corn and soybeans, cotton, peanuts, and rice and wheat. And most these subsidies are based on what's called base acres. So that means if I were a farmer and I was lucky enough to have base acres, so that means land eligible for subsidies years ago, I could receive a subsidy payment today for potentially a crop that I'm not even growing currently. Two other important points about these types of subsidies is that since they are based on acreage, they tend to flow to the largest farmers. And academics have found that they do influence some farm decision making, and they can also distort trade and markets. Next, I'm going to shift over to crop insurance. So while the federal crop insurance program covers a wider range of crops than commodity subsidies, covering 140 different crops, everything from apples to pumpkins, most of these subsidies are still flowing to the same handful of crops. So if you can flip to the next slide, please. As you can see in this pie chart, most of the crop insurance premium subsidies are still flowing to corn, soybeans, cotton, and wheat, with the blue slice of that pie including everything else. So that's where you find your apples, pumpkins, pasture, and other crops. Some basic information about the overall crop insurance program. Farmers can receive an indemnity payment through the crop insurance program if they experience a disaster, like a drought or a flood, for instance. That would be called a yield-based policy. But most farmers are actually signing up for what's called a revenue-based policy, and that means that you don't necessarily have to experience a disaster in order to receive an indemnity payment. Crop insurance subsidies are tied to the size of the farm and how many acres that a farmer is planting each year. So that means the more acres that you're farming and potentially plowing up, the more subsidies that you're eligible for. The final important point on crop insurance is that taxpayers are covering the majority of crop insurance costs. So for every $1 of crop insurance subsidy, or for the coverage, taxpayers are covering 60% of that cost, while farmers are covering just the other 40%. So this brings us to why we're here today, to talk about the impact of farm subsidies on the environment. So academics have found that these subsidies can influence the size of farms. As I mentioned, since they're tied to acreage, it can increase the likelihood that a farmer is tearing up pasture. You heard about native grassland, wetlands, and other carbon-rich land, and pushing that into crop production, particularly those crops that are highly subsidized. We also see potentially less diversification, so less growing of crops that I had on my farm growing up, which include crops like oats and sorghum. Now it's more shifted just toward corn and soybeans, at least in this part of the country in Nebraska. You also see a higher use of inputs on some of these fields, including nitrogen fertilizer. The most heavily subsidized crop, which is corn, also happens to be the crop with the highest input use, such as nitrogen fertilizer. And when that fertilizer is not taken up by the plant, you heard earlier Peter talking about some of the impacts that that can have, running off and affecting water quality and drinking water, or being released into the atmosphere. The final point I'll make on the impacts of some of these farm subsidies and crop insurance subsidies is that experts have linked them to farm consolidation and higher land prices, which can impact beginning farmers. So in conclusion, thank you for your time, and we try to emphasize that ensuring that farm subsidies are not working at cross purposes with conservation goals can ensure that taxpayer dollars are spent wisely and can also improve the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you again for joining us from Nebraska. Now, Mike Drysdale will help us connect these words on the paper to what happens on the ground, how Farm Bill affects decisions made by producers around the country. Mike is of counsel to Dorsey and Whitney, a private law firm, and has represented private industry clients on environmental matters for 30 years, including agriculture, as well as mining, solid waste, and electric utility issues. And he has many clients in the agricultural sector. I'll also say that Mike and I teach the agriculture section of the environmental law boot camp, and I can assure you that Mike is a great teacher as well as a great lawyer. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Peter. So to the extent Lavender was representing the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, my client group could be described potentially as the somewhat less sustainable agricultural coalition, because my clients are the ones who are actually doing the farming, making the decisions about what to plant, how much to plant, et cetera, that then translate into the environmental consequences that Peter talked about at the beginning of the presentation. There's both some good news and some bad news here. The bad news is there are a lot of environmental consequences to the way agriculture is practiced in the United States today, and much of that ties to the incentive structures that exist in the Farm Bill. The good news is that as a group, farmers and farming companies are exquisitely sensitive to the incentives that they are provided by the Farm Bill and similar public policies, so that if you adjust those incentives, they will respond accordingly. And to give you a flavor for how this plays out, let's start first at the top level, the thing we're not talking too much about, which is the nutrition assistance programs. As you have heard from the other presenters, corn and soybeans are the big dominant crops in the country. And part of the reason for that is that corn and soybeans are the building blocks for the many different types of fairly highly processed foods that we consume in the American diet. And the nutrition assistance programs, to the extent that they try to be relatively agnostic toward what food products are made from agricultural products, tend to be leveraged to support products that consume a lot of corn and soybeans and meat, et cetera. So in that sense, the big dollar gorilla of the Farm Bill, the hundreds of billions of dollars that goes in nutrition assistance, because of the way that's structured, is directly relates to the types of foods, types of crops that are grown, and then of course the consequences to those. Another important dimension to this is, as Sheila was talking about, an awful lot of our programs are based on base acres, amount in production, consistency of production over time. And what that does is it directly incentivizes farmers and farming organizations to ensure that they maximize production. It is generally speaking much worse to undershoot your production target than it is to overshoot your production target. And as Sheila talked about, you have input intensive crops like corn and soybeans that involve a lot of fertilizer, involve a lot of genetically modified seed, et cetera. And when you have that incentive where it's better to overshoot than undershoot, because one might point out that, you know, nitrogen fertilizer is not cheap. You know, it's an expensive input. So why would you ever want to use less of it, use more of it than you have to? Well, that's because these structures are that it's better overall for many producers if there's a little bit of excess to make sure you hit your target than there is to undershoot and then have all the consequences that may flow from that. Give you one example from, I do a lot of work in the sugar industry, which is one of the most offending and distorted industries you might imagine. So in the way the Farm Bill has historically been structured is there is a total amount of subsidized production in the industry, which is then allocated among the various producers in the industry. Your allocation is based historically upon your often most recent 3 or 4 years of production. What that means is that if you underproduce for 2-3 years, for whatever reason, you can be really penalized in the next Farm Bill and the allocation that results from that. One of my clients went through the ringer on this during one of the Farm Bill sequences, where they had a sequence of crops. They had a poor crop, then they had a crop failure, a freeze that resulted in substantial damage and lower production. And then they had, in the trifecta, they had a equipment failure that substantially reduced their total production for that year. And so going into the Farm Bill negotiations, their production and their allocation was way below where they had hoped it would be, and in fact, how they had sized their facilities to produce. So they were looking at a disaster in terms of their ability to receive revenue through the Farm Bill and maintain their production going forward. Well, then there were incentives, there were ripple effects from that because of the way the crop insurance program worked at the time. To get coverage for the crop that had beet freeze, they had to do everything they possibly could to produce as much of that crop as possible. As a result, they were processing highly damaged beets in their facility, which resulted in not only terribly low production, but all kinds of environmental consequences in terms of higher wastewater generation, higher emissions of air pollutants, et cetera, all because of the structure in the Farm Bill and where it was pushing that company to get every ounce of production out it could. Ultimately, there was a way provided in the Farm Bill for a company that was going to be short on allocation to acquire additional allocation, but in one of the very many wrinkles in the Farm Bill, you couldn't just buy allocation from another producer, you had to actually buy another company. And so that led this particular company to buy an entire other sugar company that was somewhat on that its owner was looking to sell as well, which had enormous implications for this particular company, where it produced in the United States, how much it produced, and then of course the environmental consequences flowing it. So there are many, many intertwined factors in this where the various incentives in the program directly translate into environmental consequences. I'll share another aspect of this. Mike talked about all the various very positive conservation programs that exist in the Farm Bill, but those can also be somewhat in tension with other incentives. Again, not only like I might want to produce less on some of my highly erodible farmland in order and get the benefits of this program, but if that's going to cost me in terms of what kind of subsidy I can get, how much of my crop can be insurable, et cetera, that's going to affect my decision making. The other really important player in here, there was the mention of Archer Daniels Midland. Archer Daniels Midland, Cargill, General Mills, the big consumers of the products of the farms also play a very large role in this. These industries, these companies in these industries are looking to do environmentally beneficial things themselves in terms of their overall climate footprint, the practices of their suppliers, et cetera. And so they have their own programs, which may align very well with the Farm Bill's programs, or may be in tension with the Farm Bill programs. So for example, to get the benefit of the supplier who will purchase your product, they may want you to produce larger amounts so that they can say that the practices that they've encouraged you to use will have various benefits, but that may work against some of the land preservation incentives that exist in the various Farm Bill programs. As Mike talked about, you've got this huge number of farmers that are turned away from programs, but then there's also this whole other universe that don't even apply because for any particular year, for any particular producer, it just doesn't quite make sense. So the bottom line here is that you have a sector that watches all these things extremely closely, and every year and every series of years is making decisions about what am I going to plant, how am I going to plant it, how much inputs am I going to use, how do I think about not just this Farm Bill but the next one, so that from an economic perspective, my operation is going to be sustainable, and then that produces the set of decisions that result in either the good or bad outcomes that Peter was talking about. So that's just kind of from the on the farm and the producer side of things, how they think about this, to keep in mind as we think about all these other programs that other speakers are talking about.
Great, thank you, Mike. You can see why I always enjoy working with Mike, bringing, as it were, back to reality from this DC-focused words on paper. Our next speaker is Vanessa Garcia Polanco, who will talk about challenges for young and historically underserved farmers and ranchers accessing Farm Bill programs, land, and other support. Vanessa co-designs the strategy and implementation for the National Young Farmers Coalition policy campaigns and ensures equity-driven, farmer-centric research, policy, and programmatic interventions for a more just food system. She previously worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems. And if her day job isn't enough, she also leads Dominican food studies and funnels financial and fiscal resources to Dominican food sovereignty projects. Over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to my fellow panelists for having me here. As a coalition, National Young Farmers Coalition, we are fairly young in the ecosystem of farmer advocacy. For example, we have been members of NSAC since our inception for many years, where we are able to support and collaborate in a lot of those efforts for fair competition and fair opportunities for young, small, diversified farmers and historically underserved farmers. As a coalition, we are only 13 years old. And what is really unique about us is that we see ourselves as the new generation of farmers. Most of our farmers are first generation, or they may have been a few generations removed from agriculture. Maybe their grandparents or parents were in agriculture and they had to step down because of land loss or economic downturn, or it's actually most of what we see is actually first generation folks that wanna use agriculture as a tool to fight climate change. When we survey our members constantly, they tell us that the main reason that they're farming it is to feed their communities, to fight climate change, and to address historical racial inequalities in food and agriculture. In this Farm Bill, we're really focused on increasing land access and accessing accountability to conservation programs. Because being a young farmer in this country is actually really hard, because a lot of what we have heard from the commodity, conservation, and crop insurance and credit programs doesn't allow for young beginning folks to enter. It only allows for multi-generational folks. So if your parents were farmers and they have been farming in the way we heard, especially in the commodity and crop with commodities and crop insurance, you have a shooting into this industry. When you are a young farmer who has student debt, medical debt, has childcare expenses, it's really hard for you to enter into this market, into this industry, and to compete in the market even more. So a lot of what we're focusing on this farm is especially land access. When we survey our members over and over again, we heard from them that land access is the #1 challenge that they're having because they cannot compete with these other bigger farms, more established farms, and non-farm owners. For us, it's really important to say non-land and also non-land owners too. Things like we are seeing things like hedge funds, corporations, and just bigger farms buying farmland that just using as an investment or farming in ways that a lot of farmers are not farming. So when our farmers are trying to compete to buy farmland, they are not able. And let me tell you, my farmers are not going there trying to buy 600 acres in Nebraska. They're trying to buy 10 acres in Massachusetts or Rhode Island or New York or places like that. A lot of our farmers are also, we don't see that rural urban divide. Most of our membership is actually evenly split. When we see a lot of young farmers cluster in urban areas, when we actually see more access to urban farming and urban farm incubators where they can get started. And many of farmers want to graduate to bigger farms up to 10 and 50 acres. And that's when the competition really starts and really toughens up for them when they cannot compete in these rural areas because there's a lot of the land is actually going up for sale so fast. So for that, we are working a lot, especially in the credit title, to open up more credit access and venues opportunities for them. And a lot of our ideas go from creating like a pre-approval process so farmers can compete. The same way you are pre-approved for a mortgage for your house, farmers can compete because a lot of what we are seeing is when a company comes in or a bigger farm comes in and you can give an offer to them for a farm in 3 days cash, you're gonna take the offer instead of waiting 3 or 4 weeks for my farmer offer to be processed by the bank or third party or FSA, the Farm Service Agency. So we see that disadvantage point where our farmers cannot compete in the market the way it is. But we're also thinking about other proactive ways and things that can be done at the USDA level that are not just focused on the individual farmer, but focus more on the community-based organizations that serve farmers. For example, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, we were able to do a pilot program, USDA was able to do a pilot program called the Land Access Marketing and Capital Program that gave $300 million to community-based organizations to put farmers on the land. And what was really unique about it allows them for many different opportunities. It could be a farm incubator, it could be more market opportunities for farmers, it could be focused on land access in many different ways. The department was really non-prescriptive in that way. It's because land access issues look really different by county, by city, by state, depending on the laws and the local laws that govern land access there. For example, we see this all the time, especially in my home state, where it's easier to go to Vermont to buy land than to buy farmland in Rhode Island, because we have more competition for second home ownership. And also we have less land because we're the smallest state. So we do see that, and was something really innovative about the program, it allowed for really localized community interventions that were community-led, and they were really farmer-driven. It really focused on the farmers and what the farmers need and want. So right now at USDA, we do not have a program. We don't have a Farm Bill program that focuses on putting farmers on the land. We do have extensive programs that focus on training farmers and historically underserved farmers to gain skills to markets, production, and most of them are actually in the miscellaneous title or under the research title, attached usually to universities or usually led by community-based organizations to train farmers. But we do not have a Farm Bill program that addresses land access. What is the number one thing that young farmers are reporting is the challenge. Continuing in the thread about access and accountability, what we know is that young farmers are early adopters of good conservation practices that are related to climate smart practices. Well, as Mike told you, we are part of that beautiful, really large 75% of young applicants that want to access conservation programs and cannot. So for this Farm Bill, we're really focused on expanding conservation opportunities, so those programs can better serve for farmers, and also focusing on just what is the infrastructure that is not allowing a lot of these applications to be processed, that is not just funding. Things that we know that the conservation service is understaffed. So, and also takes a long time for these applications to be returned and processed. So we know that's also determined when we actually know that our farmers are more interested in applying for conservation programs than through credit programs. And we see that reported in our data. When we survey our farmers nationwide, around 20% of them report using a conservation program compared to other lending and credit programs that was at 3 and 4%. And also crop insurance, that's also a mechanism that is not available to a lot of our farmers because our farmers are extremely diversified. They are growing up to 30, 40 different crops. They're focusing on direct market sales and things like community supported agriculture, farmers market, and so wholesale to institutions. So we do see that there is a huge discrepancy there on what Farm Bill programs focus and fund in basis where the new generation is interested in farming. And I just want to close up with the third thing that we mostly focus on young farmers is this idea of access and accountability. What we have seen, we have what I usually like to call a cultural mismatch on the way that Farm Bill programs and also traditionally the Department of Agriculture and like FSA county offices and conservation programs offices run when they may not understand how this new generation of people want to farm. And that is really focused on diversification, really focused on conservation programs and conservation practices that are climate smart and climate forward. And just the markets are really different. Again, my farmers are selling in farmers market, direct consumer sales in other venues. They're not selling to Cargill or anyone like that. So we need to really focus on creating Farm Bill programs that have the cultural competency for the way the next generation wants to farm. And also there are other parts of the Farm Bill that are doing this, but they're not farmer forward or farmer centric. They're more infrastructure related, which is needed. We need to build that infrastructure. And those are usually more things like the local food programs that we mentioned, usually slotted across different titles in the Farm Bill. But those are the main things our farmers are focused on this Farm Bill. And obviously what we're hearing is a lot of no new monies. But at the same time, we are the young farmers of this country. We need to push the envelope so new Farm Bill programs can be created. Some of the Farm Bill programs that we have now to serve young farmers did not exist 30 years ago. So we know that it's our duty to push every Farm Bill, and especially this one, when we know so much of the farmland in this country is going to change in the next 10 years, because the average age of a farmer is 59. So again, no new programs. We hear that message, but we're still pushing because we need to invest in the next generation. Again, farmers, if we want to have the environmental outcomes that we desire, because my farmers are really the early adopters on the front lines of the climate crisis. And they just need more resources and to be able to access the conservation programs so they can continue fighting climate change.
Thank you, Vanessa. And it's always exciting to realize just how varied US agriculture is. You mentioned urban farming and how different we sometimes think about corn and soy in the Midwest, but there's farming in every state in the country and every different type of crop, which is both the exciting part, also a real challenge to think of one law that somehow manages to address this, or one agency that has to deal with all of this. And so that brings us to Vidisha Bhattacharya, our next speaker from the US Department of Agriculture, Vidisha joined the Biden-Harris administration in February 2021 and advises on a whole range of climate and conservation issues, including the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, trying to figure out what to do with the Inflation Reduction Act that a few people have talked about, as well as expansion of landscape scale wildlife conservation, and the important question of how do you measure all of this. Previously, Vidisha held senior roles with the climate team at the Center for American Progress and also in the private sector at Village Capital, and even had stints deploying solar energy in rural India, and spent 4 years, as many people in DC did, on Capitol Hill. So we're very lucky to have Vidisha here talking about the administration's view of all of this.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks to my colleagues on the panel, many organizations that USDA works very closely with and are very important partners in our implementation of the Farm Bill and all of our work. So I think the folks on this panel have done a really nice job laying out a lot of what the Farm Bill is and why it's important. I'll talk a little bit about this administration, the priorities, and why it's so critical to have a Farm Bill that continues to support those priorities. This Farm Bill, I think if you hear Secretary Vilsack talk, he will talk all the time about how we've seen, and I think many of my colleagues have alluded to this as well, the challenge of the small and mid-sized producer. So we've gotten really, really good at producing food with a lot of productivity, but it's often led to bigger farms, consolidation, et cetera. So those are issues that, and rural America is, as many also have alluded to, not always reaping the benefits of the way that the system works today. So, and especially when you look at underserved producers, small producers, they have often been left out, left behind in ways that this administration has prioritized and have been working to address head on. So I think the Farm Bill, as we look toward it, looking forward to working with Congress to continue to build on some of that progress and really support them in figuring out how to move forward. I just want to provide a little bit of context on where we are on the Farm Bill. So I think it expires this year. I think you've probably picked that up. And first and foremost, our colleagues in Congress will hopefully fund our agency after November 17th, which is when we have funding currently for a bunch of programs. The Farm Bill will last at the end of the year. Things will not shut down overnight on everything USDA does. There's only certain things that are funded through the Farm Bill and not others, but we do have, county offices in every county in America that serve producers that will not be operational if we do not see a Farm Bill by the end of the year. A lot of the programs won't be affected right away because of the way they are funded, but then other programs such as we talked about the Conservation Reserve Program, which is one of our main conservation programs. We can't enroll more acres in that. Some of our safety net programs, dairy programs, et cetera, can't be implemented. And more broadly speaking, the Farm Bill is just the foundation of a lot of the work that we do in this world of climate and conservation. And if we don't have those programs funded, we cannot implement them. So it's very important that Congress pass a Farm Bill. Some of my colleagues alluded to the IRA investments and the importance of defending those and keeping those intact and focused on the things they are intended to be focused on. That is a deep priority of the administration and of the secretary. So just wanted to +1 all of those comments. So USDA has a huge footprint across the country to implement all of its work. I don't think people understand how large our agency is or all of the things that it does. As one of the slides earlier said, it's a little bit of a misnomer to just say we are the Department of Agriculture. We do a whole lot of other things in rural development and clean water and infrastructure and broadband and all kinds of things, nutrition, forestry. So, but we have 95,000 employees around the country. We are one of the largest federal agencies. And so when you talk about implementing this work and the environmental impacts thereof, it is being done by a very large workforce around the country. So that's just one thing I wanted folks to understand and absorb. We are present in every single county in America. Urban, rural, we're opening more and more urban county offices now, which has been a new thing under this administration, very exciting, as we look for new ways to support producers, not just the folks that you kind of think of when you think right away about farmers, but also those urban producers, the underserved landowners in various parts of the country. So I was asked today to talk a little bit about why this matters for people who care about various things in the environmental world. And so I think, as you can see from a lot of the comments here, we have a lot of tools in our toolkit at USDA to support conservation. And I will focus on the agriculture side of things, so the private land side, though I will say USDA also runs the Forest Service, so we have a big public lands footprint as well. But in the private land side, farmers, ranchers, forest landowners, that's private land is 60% of the land in the US. So if you care about wildlife connectivity and corridors, if you care about water quality, if you care about air quality, if you care about anything that takes large scale conservation, it has to work with private landowners, because if you don't, you will not get there. And so I think that's something people often forget, is you think about public lands a lot, which I love. I love my national parks, love my national forests, and they are very, very important assets to our country. However, that is, when you think of conservation and land alone in the public space, you're missing the largest chunk of the picture. And why does it matter? Because when you look at things like other laws, environmental laws, like the Endangered Species Act, for example, where do a lot of those critters live? Often on farm and rangeland. And where are the tools that can support those producers in doing the right thing, both for their farm, but also for those critters? In the Farm Bill, a lot of the Farm Bill tools that we're talking about. So we've done a lot of interesting work in looking at our tools and how we can put them to use in different ways to continue to tackle some of these major challenges. There's been a lot of talk on climate here. Absolutely. A lot of these practices have climate benefits. So how can we, even before the Inflation Reduction Act passed, we were looking at the CRP program, for example, and prioritizing the practices that we know have climate benefits, and adding points to those, et cetera. So, and then the IRA passed, and now we have a lot more funding to work with on the climate front. But let's not forget all of the other co-benefits and really, really critical co-benefits on a lot of the other issues that people care about, whether it's wildlife, water quality, air quality, et cetera. So I think my hope is that people can come away with this, remembering the private land side of the picture, and that you can't get to a lot of the large outcomes and very important environmental outcomes and progress that we are trying to make across a whole host of issues if you don't think about private land. And the voluntary efforts of private landowners, farmers who are facing the impacts of climate change head on every single day, who do not make money farming. Like, that's the thing. You've heard a lot here about how much support there are for producers sort of on the safety net side. And yet the majority of farmers do not make their majority of their income off the farm. And that is a broken system too. So how do you support folks who are trying to do all the right thing in many different ways and make a living, move in the direction of adopting a lot of the practices that will provide the environmental benefits we're looking for? That's where it's really critical to work with partners who have trusted relationships with those producers, and Farm Bill programs have built in technical assistance funds to do exactly that, to provide TA through partners, to do outreach through partners. And so we always like to hone in on voluntary, locally led approaches and partner-driven approaches, because USDA as an agency cannot do this alone. You have to really be able to build a relationship with the landowner on the ground. NRCS, our Natural Resources Conservation Service, does a lot of that, but definitely does not do it alone. And so working with folks like the Young Farmers or NSAC or many hundreds of organizations around the country is really critical. Let's see, I'm just looking through my notes on what else I wanted to emphasize here. I think I will pause there. I think the other thing I'll say is we were talking about the Farm Bill today, so I'm sort of leaving out a whole bunch of other stuff we're doing that's not Farm Bill related, but is very large scale. One I'll mention was mentioned in Peter's intro, the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities effort. So before IRA passed, we looked at some of our authorities. And there's another law called that sets up this entity called the Commodity Credit Corporation. And it provides USDA a broad set of authorities, largely centered around supporting producers, expanding markets. So it's used for a whole host of things. It funds a lot of the Farm Bill. So it funds a lot of the Farm Bill programs too. It's its own complex thing, but we have authorities in there to act to expand markets for producers. And so when we looked at climate and we saw there is, you know, I think you spoke about ADM and others, there's enormous pull right now from the private sector to do something on climate and to green its supply chain. There's also enormous pull from consumers to eat responsibly grown food. We're seeing carbon markets and other places where there's just market demand for products and agricultural commodities. And I use this word commodity in this sense in a very broad frame. So not like you're just your corn, soybean, the service, anything grown on a farm. That is grown in a way that has less of a climate impact and that is credible, verifiable, et cetera. So a lot of the investments that we're making right now are focused on that. And the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities effort was stood up using our authorities under a different law, but we're investing over $3 billion in partner-led, amazing diversity of partner-led projects across the country, covering every single state, all around scaling adoption of climate smart practices, doing credible monitoring verification of those, the greenhouse gas benefits, and then marketing those products, commodities that are coming out of those. So that's happening alongside the Inflation Reduction Act investment. So it's a very exciting time. There's a lot of opportunity in the next 5 to 10 years to make a huge impact that I do think will be transformative for agriculture. And this next Farm Bill is right in the middle of that. So we have to get it right and make sure we can continue to do things in a way that's going to support and kind of continue us along this path of really leveraging the power of private lands and private landowners and farmers and ranchers in being stewards of the environment for a whole host of reasons. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Vidita, and thank you again for our terrific panel. We do have time for some questions. So I've gotten some questions that have come in over the wire. So I'll ask those of the panel, and then we can see if people here have some questions. One is just a sort of more technical question on the main conservation program. So maybe this is for Mike or Vidisha, CSP and EQIP in particular, Conservation Stewardship Program and Environmental Quality Program. What are, is there a difference in the size? Or they generally go to the big things, to the little things? It was one question. And another was, do they fund anaerobic digesters at animal operations? Two questions that came in.
I'm happy to.
Vidisha?
Sure. So I think the first question was sort of difference between CSP and EQIP.
For the CSP and EQIP, is there a general, do they generally go to bigger producers, smaller? How do you try to address the size question?
So I mean, they are size agnostic, and I would defer to other colleagues on this panel also if they want to speak into that. I think they're different, and I think folks know that CSP is for sort of like enhancements to existing conservation, so taking our conservation to the next level. So I imagine there is a different set of producers who'd be looking to CSP versus EQIP. EQIP is sort of your foot in the door, you know, practice by practice support. And second question was
anaerobic digesters.
Anaerobic digesters. So anaerobic digesters are up a practice. There's practice support supported through NRCS programs for anaerobic digesters. I will say the vast majority of anaerobic digester funding at USDA actually lives in a different part of USDA called Rural Development, the Rural Business Cooperative Service, and the REAP program. So generally what you actually see is neither are supporting large numbers of digesters at the moment, but NRCS supports other sort of infrastructure around manure management, et cetera, more often than they do funding actual digesters, whereas RD, because of the nature of that program, is doing more of those investments.
Thank you.
And I would just add on to what Vidisha said. I think broadly speaking, thinking of EQIP as the more shorter term, more narrowly practiced focused conservation program, where at least at NSAC, we tend to think EQIP can be a gateway and should be, building up towards participation in CSP, which is more about longer term engagement over the course of 5 years, if not longer, whole farm conservation, and really what many of our farmers are telling us, and certainly broader than that, just that, increasing agricultural diversification, the extent to which we need to, both for adaptation and mitigation. CSP is what we view it as. NSAC is really the destination we need to be headed to reach those higher levels of climate adaptation and conservation.
Yeah, and what I can add is our farmers are deeply interested in EQIP, but what we see is because if you don't have a conservation program already, it's really hard to get started. And EQIP is, like we just said, that first line conservation program. So actually one of our proposals in this farm bill is called the Small Farm Conservation Act that will incentivize more small farmers to apply for EQIP. Because what we know is small farms want to enter into EQIP, but because of funding and other conservation restrictions, the paperwork and the law makes it less accessible for them. So we do want to incentivize more small farms because they do have interest.
Thank you. I'm just this. Another question that came in is, what about pesticides? We know a lot about pesticides is an issue for agriculture. How does the Farm Bill address pesticides, if at all? Do you want to?
Maybe defer to you on the first on that.
Well, I'll give the first crack, which is largely pesticides are regulated by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. There's the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA, under which EPA registers pesticides for use under certain conditions. Some of the issues that may come up in the Farm Bill are really not focused on that, but so much as, for example, efforts to address who regulates pesticides. There's a lot of state and local governments that want to, for example, impose greater protections for their citizens from pesticide use, and some effort in the pesticide industry not to allow local governments and states to do that. So there may be some questions of whether the Farm Bill will have provisions, for example, limiting local governments' ability to do that. Core regulation of pesticides is not in the Farm Bill, but ancillary issues like this may in fact come up in the Farm Bill debate. Anyone else want to?
I would just add that even if something like that is not included in the base version of a Farm Bill draft, things like that are always potentially out there in terms of amendments or different riders that we have to track. So it can pop up in different ways.
Vidisha.
And I was just gonna say, I think in the context of pesticides, when it comes to say pollinators or their species, there's other tools in the Farm Bill through our conservation programs to proactively do things to sort of not necessarily abate the pesticide use per se, but like create habitat for the critters you're trying to protect potentially. So there's also the human, I know people talking about the human health side maybe on this one, but it's all linked. And the Farm Bill programs definitely do play a role with, more broadly speaking, helping producers sort of proactively address some of these things. We see this a lot in terms of Endangered Species Act too, where there's issues like a certain critter that you need to protect, and how can the producer proactively do something to sort of like help it become a more friendly regulatory environment for them. So those things you see a lot, which the pesticides, there's sort of one example of that kind of interaction.
Thank you. Another question, and maybe Sheila, you can answer this one. Somebody asked, what would happen, even if politically implausible, if there were just many fewer subsidies, if we didn't have as much of a farm safety net? What would happen, and what would that mean for American agriculture?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a great one. I think first we would see significant taxpayer savings, to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. And then there would likely be impacts at the margin. So a lot of those impacts on the land that we mentioned, maybe you wouldn't have as many wetlands coming into agricultural production, grasslands. There's a recent report released about that, and some of those other impacts.
One of the questions that you mentioned, Sheila, earlier, studies that show some of the specifics. For example, crop rotation is an important opportunity to reduce impacts, but some of the programs, the way they're designed, the subsidy programs, make it essentially would penalize a producer for having crop rotations. And so some of the bills and some of the discussions you see in the Farm Bill is how can these programs, I think most of the conversations are not eliminating them, but rather amending them to recognize some of these beneficial practices and how at least these programs wouldn't inhibit farmers who want to use these practices. So another question, a couple of questions came up just generally. Okay, so what's up with the 2023 Farm Bill? Is it going to happen? Does anyone want to tackle that just to give an overview of the politics we can imagine ahead? Mike,
it will happen. So as Bidisha mentioned, the 2018 Farm Bill expired just about a month ago on October 1st. So we're now without an extension. So we're now without a new Farm Bill past the expiration of the 2018 bill. Just within the past few days, week or so, Congress has really increasingly turned its attention to an extension of the 2018 Farm Bill, which they may consider attaching to any must-pass legislation that could move before the end of the year. I think the prospects for getting reauthorizing this Farm Bill are still achievable, right? But I think we're really looking towards the early part of next year when we'll see a bulk of action and hopefully ultimately passage. But pegging that more specifically than perhaps the first quarter or early part of next year is really difficult. But it seems like just when you look at the calendar this year, you look at all the things they were dealing with around November 17th and the potential shutdown, it's hard to see how they would make that work just in terms of scheduling. And so I think really looking towards next year, I'd love to hear what other panelists have to say.
I know that we keep a score on the NSAC office of when we feel like Farm Bill will be out, and I know I lost already. So that's what I can tell you. I think right now, as Mike says, just we're staying really adaptable and flexible, and this is not unprecedented. We have seen this in the 2012, that became the 2014 Farm Bill, and in the 2018 too, there was a little delay. So I think we're just always staying adaptable on seeing all the factors are coming in.
Any other comments on that? So one last quick question. Bidisha, I think you mentioned, and maybe Mike, you also mentioned, oh, do I have a question out here? Okay.
I'm wondering if you're going to ask us if we had any questions.
I will ask after this one question, the last question that came up. Carbon markets, I think you both mentioned. And there was the Growing Climate Solutions Act that Congress looked at before. Can you briefly describe what they are, and will that be part of the Farm Bill?
So carbon markets are, I think some people refer to them as offsets, but they're markets. There's voluntary and compliance markets out there all around. And they're not just about agriculture. In fact, largely they're not about agriculture, but they're ways to they're offset markets. So a company or an entity or a government or however there's international markets it's a mechanism to allow for certain say carbon sequestration or other actions to be able to be counted against an emitter over here. So sort of being able to say, instead of, if it's really hard for me to reduce emissions over here, can I pay instead to reduce emissions over there? So that's a very crude way of describing what carbon offset markets are. The Growing Climate Solutions Act passed at the end of last year. It directs USDA to sort of help through a variety of actions, sort of provide a little bit more structure and organization and clarity on what protocols are good. I think there's a lot of confusion out there right now. There's a lot of different protocols and registries. So we just put out a report recently, and which was directed by that legislation. And the next steps will be the Secretary's decision to stand up a program at USDA to then provide a list of certified entities that can help producers. Agriculture doesn't right now play a big role in offset markets. There are some protocols for ag. They are very, very rarely used. They're very tedious. The measurement, monitoring, verification is very onerous. So they just don't work for farmers. So if you have farmers who are doing, sequestering carbon on their farm, for example, and they wanted to tap into this market opportunity as one of many market opportunities out there right now, it's not very easy for them to do. So what this legislation is intending to do is try to figure out what are the barriers and sort of move USDA down the road of helping solve some of those through kind of just providing a little bit more clarity, providing a better understanding of which protocols are solid, and providing a registry of third-party certifiers. So we will be, the report just came out, and next steps to come, but that's sort of the short synopsis there.
Thank you. And over here for a question at home.
Thanks, and other people may have as well. In terms of the future of farming and the future of farm ownership, I'm wondering if in the new farm bill, there's any thinking about how to address that transition that we can all see coming. So we have farmers getting older, we do programs that are helping beginning farmers and helping more diverse farmers in terms of practices. But are we going to be facing a future of corporate farm ownership, or is there some thinking about how to maintain people who are interested in getting in at the sort of smaller land scale? And I'm not familiar if there's anything currently, but it seems like in the future we really do need that.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a little what we're trying to focus. We at least want to set the precedent. We've done USDA that they did this pilot because it really gave us a mechanism, because we have been talking for a long time with them and we partners in the Hill. Like, we need to have something, and I'm exactly sure what it looks like, because we got from much feedback. And when USDA started this pilot program, it was like, okay, this is a right mechanism, because it allows community-based organizations to determine what is needed for land access and for the farmers in their localities. And that allows for over-term markets for farmers to get more access to land. And obviously, what it happens is it was just a pilot program, a little bit what we heard about the climate smart commodities and other stuff like that. We do not have authority in anywhere in the Farm Bill, and we're trying to get this program authorized and funded through the Farm Bill. And what we're asking is a really modest investment, only $100 million over 5 years, which in the scope of Farm Bill programs, that's like nothing. I think we calculated it's like 1% of 1% of the conservation programs. It's like such a tiny ask just to get started. If at least we cannot get it funded because of no new monies, well, at least we can get it authorized, and then we can fight through the appropriation cycles and future farm bills. As I said earlier, 30 years ago, we did not have beginning farmer training resources. So right now, we're just trying to set a precedent that we need to have a farmland access program, that it is a farm bill program to put young farmers on the land. So again, we can preserve even what you said, private land ownership in agriculture.
If I could just add real quick, in addition to everything Vanessa shared around land access and making sure that the programs that we do have are actually accessible for young and beginning farmers and even folks who fall outside of that, we can't lose sight of the impact and the role that market opportunities, and also thinking about local and regional food systems and how we can make sure that we're not just providing access to land and making sure that folks can access programs, but over the long term, what market are they plugging into and what opportunities do they have to be viable and successful? And so there's a lot of opportunities to think about, both within local and regional food systems and things like procurement and even beyond, that we can think about making sure that folks maybe who don't currently see themselves or can't identify a market have those opportunities. And there are components of those things in marker bills, and we expect to see at least some components in draft versions of the Farm Bill.
And I would add one last important element is over half of American farmland is operated by others than the owners, which is to say non-operating landowners own more than half of American farmland. They own it just like another asset that they own anything else. It's not that they're actually farming it. And that actually provides a lot of opportunity. And I think there are USDA programs to encourage those non-operating landowners to think about selling their land to farmers who want to get in. So that well, we're not making more land. There is a lot of land out there that perhaps can be addressed.
And I will just say that is, I think, a big challenge. So I grew up on the farm and I then was a non-operating farm owner. And you don't hear from USDA at all when you're in that category. So I think that's a big challenge because the delegation is really to the farmer who's managing your land.
Right.
And if you want to go into USDA, you know, I finally participated in CREP, but it took me a really long time to even find it. So I think the communication to that group is a big challenge, which you probably already know.
Any other questions from here?
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. I have a two-part question. One is at the beginning of the presentation, Peter laid out the tremendous amount of carbon emissions which agriculture industry causes, and something that wasn't mentioned or brought up is kind of the outsized impact animal agriculture has in those emissions. I think it's almost like 70 or 80% of the agriculture emissions are from animal agriculture. So I wanted to ask, what's the connection between the Farm Bill? Are there any valences between that and animal agriculture and managing that? How does that play into that system? And then the second part of the question, Mike from NSAC mentioned kind of the funding that can go into a bunch of programs that currently exist, like CFP and EQIP and such for reducing carbon emissions for agriculture. I'm wondering how far that funding will go in decreasing carbon emissions and what the next steps are to fight climate change using these programs.
So let me first do a process check. I think we're over time. Can we answer these questions? Okay. Well, I think, and I'd invite others to join, but we briefly touched on a few of the key areas in the Farm Bill. Much of the subsidies, as you saw, much of the support is for corn and soy, which is largely used for animal feed. And so that is an indirect subsidy for animal agriculture. There are other programs in the Farm Bill, which we didn't discuss in detail, that address animal agriculture, livestock programs, and particularly the dairy program, the dairy margin program, which Sheila mentioned briefly. So there are those. I think there's also, this is where the Farm Bill shouldn't be viewed in isolation. There are also environmental laws that govern air and water pollution and that largely don't address animal agriculture. So in a sense, create a indirect subsidy of allowing pollution that might not happen in other industries. So those are all ways that the program does or doesn't affect animal agriculture. Does anyone want to add to that?
I mean, it's a good question. I would add, you know, one of the components of EQIP, there's something called the livestock set aside, which directs, I think it's roughly 50% to 2/3 of, 50% to livestock practices surrounding livestock. A lot of that funding tends to go to support large confined animal feeding operations or types of livestock agriculture that are not necessarily conducive to the environment or to the climate. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to look at, and both within the context of this Farm Bill, but longer term is where is that money going towards, and is it supporting goals that align with this USDA's goals and the Biden administration's goals? Certainly at NSAC, we've been thinking through, making those investments into more gearing them towards sustainable livestock production, right? We support farmers and ranchers; those are our members. Those folks have a role in our food and farm system. It's not all going to be cell-based meat or plant-based meat, but making sure that the livestock farming that we do in ranching we do have is more sustainably done, and there are ways to do that. And so it's in part about increasing the incentivization of those types of practices within conservation programs.
And I'll just say, I mean, absolutely, it's very relevant for Farm Bill programs. So all of the programs NRCS has a bunch of practices on its climate smart activities list that are focused on livestock, on methane. I mean, I think you're mainly talking about methane, enteric methane, manure, methane, and there's, specific practices that the agency can fund to help producers address those emissions. There's also sort of like emerging technologies in the space, a very fast moving space on the science of things like feed additives, things like even genetic modifications and things you can do. So there's all kinds of stuff going on. So the agency has to track that stuff. And the process is eventually, when there's science backing the impacts of a practice, it can become what's called a practice standard, which then a producer can implement and get funding for through a Farm Bill program. So very much in very relevant. And I think, the focus on methane is very front and center right now for a lot of reasons on the climate side and Farm Bill. And plus there's a lot of work happening at USDA and kind of across the federal government right now, thinking about methane and ag emissions. So globally as well.
And I would finally add that we haven't discussed in detail, there's a research title in the Farm Bill. During the Obama administration, they created some what were called climate hubs, which were focuses of research on climate impact of agriculture. Those were largely not funded much during the prior administration and were refunded now. And there's certainly going to push to try to permanently authorize and fund the climate hubs with a real focus on what are the practices that can reduce the most significant greenhouse gas emissions, which, as you heard, are methane, largely from cattle belching and manure, and nitrous oxide. And American agricultural research, which used to be by far the world's leader, has really plunged over the last decades. And by and large, I think there was a UC Davis study that found that for every dollar of research in agriculture, there's I think a $20 return. It's about the best investment you can make. And so we'll see more sustainable agriculture research funded and fully supported in this next Farm Bill. And I think that is it. So thank you very much to this terrific panel on the Farm Bill, and we will hope that we will see a climate-friendly, sustainably focused Farm Bill before too long.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you, everyone.
you.
That concludes our event. For our online audience, thank you so much for joining us. A big thank you once again to all of our wonderful speakers. And for our in-person folks, thank you so much for coming out. Please grab candy on your way out. We have lots of candy. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Jessica and Stephen Norris.
I don't even know who they are. So
Okay.
that's not very close. Who are they? Jessica who?
Jessica Harden. Harkin.
Oh, Jessica's our special assistant.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
and Stephanie, I think it's just a climate.
People.
Yeah.
Stephanie.
Yeah, that's a good turnout.
At USDA.
Yeah.
And